This is a 5-year-old song. This is a 5-year-old video. This is a picture of society 5 years ago. You'll notice the lack of a deadly virus rampaging throughout the streets. And this is a 5-year-old game. I know this isn't news to anybody, but it's still freaking crazy. And what's even crazier is that after 5 years of playing this game, I finally come to an epiphany of sorts, which is why I decided to make this half review, half storytelling video, or whatever you want to call it. Hey, better late than never. That's what I always used to say when I was turning my homework in high school. Some of you know from being around here for a little bit that my favorite franchise is Zelda. These were the first words on my channel, in fact.
And this one's about Zelda, which just happens to be my favorite subject, by the way.
Don't watch that video. Just don't do it. But furthermore, some of you will also know that Breath of the Wild is not my favorite Zelda game. Had a lot of mixed reactions when I made that tier list a couple months ago and didn't slot Breath of the Wild in at the top. But one thing that I've always wanted to do is explain to you why Breath of the Wild is not my favorite Zelda game. The year was 1996. After the omnipotent powers that be had enough secondhand embarrassment from American pop culture in the 90s, they decided to give humanity a blessing the likes of which we had never seen before. And that's why I was born. One of my first memories of life, no joke, is sitting on my grandpa's lap when I was around 2 or 3 years old and playing Ocarina of Time. On, this very cartridge, actually. Now, even though I was a spiritual blessing upon the world, I was still a little kid, which means I was stupid. I didn't actually get anywhere in the game. In fact, I'm pretty sure all I ended up doing was running Link into the walls of Kokiri Forest for hours on end, or however long my kid patience lasted. When Link would run over a block and jump, or climb up a wall, I thought I was the next era-defining genius. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I didn't actually end up beating Ocarina of Time until I was much older, like 8 or 9 years old, right before Twilight Princess came out. Listen, back in those days, kids like me didn't have ready access to the internet at the drop of a hat like kids these days do. So yes, it took me forever because I was stupid, but we all kind of were back then. I can't tell you how many hours I spent just running around the marketplace talking to everybody. I thought that eventually Zelda would come out of the courtyard and play. She never did. The point is, I grew up with Zelda being my entire childhood. Of course, I did have some other games like Super Mario 64 or Donkey Kong 64 or Metroid Prime within a couple years, and I loved them all. But Ocarina of Time not only stuck with me the longest, but it defined what not only an action-adventure game is supposed to be, but what makes a Zelda game a Zelda game. And in the years to come, when I played through Wind Waker or Twilight Princess, much quicker, might I add, this was only enforced since those games expounded on the best parts of Ocarina of Time. They had more exploration, more dungeons, more music, more enemies, but the same Zelda formula. So here's the part of the video where we transition into what I thought about Breath of the Wild. Hello, my name is 1000 YouTubers. I am here explaining my review of a very famous game that's already been covered by 1000 YouTubers. In all seriousness though, I realize that everyone's heard just about every opinion on Breath of the Wild under the sun by now, but I'm gonna tell you what I think anyway. Obviously there was, and still is, so much to love about Breath of the Wild every time you boot the game up. In terms of gameplay, Nintendo absolutely nailed what is perhaps the most important detail to get right in an adventure game: the feel of controlling your character. I mean, it even felt good to hop around as Link when you're traversing the enormous world of Hyrule. Having the dedicated sprint feature from Skyward Sword and a bunch of other games return to Breath of the Wild and tightening up Link's turning radius has produced what is still perhaps, in my opinion, the best feeling third-person game I've ever played to date. Even when you're riding a horse through the ridiculously large fields in the game. Getting the feel of riding a wild animal is something that a lot of games struggle with. But in Breath of the Wild's case, it was this perfect blend of a little initial learning curve to how to steer your horse where you want it to go and tame it, and a great feel to controlling or not controlling exactly where you want it to go. That auto steer feature is still one of the greatest quality of life improvements to controlling an animal in any video game ever. And this isn't even mentioning including the fact that they introduced climbing to this game, coupled with the amazingly simplistic paraglider. I mean, it is such a simple concept, but it's freaking genius, because you work so hard to climb up something and you put all this time and effort into planning exactly how far you can go with your current stamina, whether it's raining or not, and mapping out a path over some extremely tall structures in the game, and you slowly but surely make it up to the top. And once you're up there, all your hard work pays off by giving you a vantage point from which you can mark places you want to go in the world, glide to places that you couldn't have gotten to before, or just cover more ground more quickly. I mean, I almost feel like it's a metaphor for life. No pain, no gain. God, I gotta hit the gym. And with nearly every surface in the game being climbable, coupled with the fact that this is one of the biggest game maps to be ever introduced in a single player game, the sheer amount of details everywhere that Nintendo packed into its map will just take your breath away. No pun intended. But of course, Nintendo couldn't allow players to always be able to climb over stuff, because that takes away from a whole bunch of 3D puzzle ideas, which is something that the Zelda universe has been pretty well known for ever since they made the jump to 3D. So in places where they used these Zelda-like 3D puzzles, like shrines or divine beasts, they simply removed your ability to climb, which was a little jarring when that was literally one of the core mechanics of the game everywhere else. And I know the surface of the Sheikah structures is apparently too smooth for Link to climb on, but pardon me for going into super nerdy mode, but as you can see, given that Link is shown to be able to climb up the smooth surfaces of sand, rock, or, you know, wet ice other places in the game, I just feel like it doesn't make much sense. But you know, it's just one of those things that is what it is, I suppose. I mean, ultimately they more than made up for taking away climbing in those specific locations with the sheer amount of verticality everywhere else. Combat was also brilliantly simplistic in this game as well, finally capitalizing on those same dodge moves that the gracefully backflipping Link has been able to do in all the 3D Zelda games up until this point, by rewarding a well-timed dodge with slowed time and some free damage. Not to mention it looks badass as well. But before too long, your weapons break. Now I could ramble on about the infamous weapon durability system in Breath of the Wild, but I'll summarize it for you by saying just this. While I understand completely why a lot of players out there were extremely frustrated by this, it never really bothered me all that much. Probably because I was always killing things and getting their new weapons. Because killing things is fun. It was fun to swing around a giant two-handed weapon and sometimes a one-handed blade or blunt weapon or a two-handed jabbing spear. Every time your weapon would break, it would force you to switch to something else, and there was just enough variety in weapon drops that it always kept things fresh and, I don't know, feeling nice to me. And I honestly enjoyed it because it also makes you get better with all sorts of different kinds of weapons in the game. Plus, I mean, if a weapon broke, you could quickly swap weapons to whichever other weapon you had in your inventory at the click of a button, and it paused time for you no matter how many enemies were right around you trying to cut your giblets off. I mean, what could be more convenient? Motion controls were married to the analog stick in holy matrimony. You could aim your bow shot or weapon throw over long distances by controlling it with the analog stick, but then zero into the fine shot with just the movements of your wrist at the same time. And because of this, since you could use the stick as well as your wrist, you never had to press a button to recenter your aim, unlike some games. And one of the coolest things about the game was the fact that the entire world was a physics engine sandbox that worked extremely well. Most of the time. And I'm not just talking about some items having physics applied to them, like bombs that can roll around like in previous Zelda games. Literally everything besides like big buildings has calculable mass in-game applied to it that can be manipulated with all the tools that they give you in-game to manipulate physics. I mean, just check out Videogamedunkey's video about Breath of the Wild. The dude uses Korok leaves and Octorok balloons to make flying ships. I mean, what? One of the coolest things that video games have been evolving into more and more over the years is physics engines. And pretty much any game that introduces a good one is guaranteed to be at least somewhat of a hit just because of how much fun you can have with virtual physics, where you can be as destructive as you want to be with none of the repercussions from real life. Case in point, Half-Life 2 or Halo 3. And I know those two games are great for a bunch of different reasons, but one of the big reasons for both of them is their phenomenal physics systems. In Breath of the Wild, You can drop boulders on enemies and chuck metal objects through the air. The physics engine handles it all perfectly. You can freely manipulate metal objects through the air or freeze items and even enemies in place to create some truly memorable moments. And even the music of Breath of the Wild was something that I wasn't exactly a fan of at first, but I've gradually learned to appreciate more than anything recently. And I'm not even talking about the amazing music from the trailers. Lots of people criticize the game for not having like a catchy Hyrule Field theme, for instance, like in the previous titles, but that was actually a design choice from the developers of Breath of the Wild. Because of the way that the game is designed, players spend lots of time in big open areas that are all the same area, because those areas are so massive. In case you haven't noticed, what was once Hyrule Field is now the world of Hyrule. So hearing the same 3-minute loop of trumpets blasting and whatever for a Hyrule Field theme would probably get old after, I don't know, 2 hours or so of gameplay. And they still made unique, catchy, memorable tracks for a lot of their specific places like Gerudo Town or Rito Village or Zora's Domain, or their character themes like the music for Urbosa or Mipha, which ties into her little brother Sidon's theme. No joke, it's actually quite the fascinating Sorry about that. It's actually rather fascinating, is what I was trying to say, to dive into all of the thought and structure and development that went into the music of Breath of the Wild. In fact, I actually narrated a video from Reuven Wagner here on YouTube, delving into this very subject. So if you're interested in learning more about the music of Breath of the Wild, I will link to that in the description below. I'm sure you've heard this 100 times before, and you're gonna hear it 100 more times, but really, the feeling, the experience of playing Breath of the Wild is absolutely unparalleled. That feeling that you get from discovering a new biome or coming across a big new enemy camp and deciding exactly how you're going to take them out, and the changing weather and the climbing and the discoveries and all of it is just a priceless experience, and in my opinion, the very reason why it won Game of the Year 2017. And it's true, it didn't introduce anything new to gaming as a whole. I mean, countless other games have had music and armor and exploration, etc. But Breath of the Wild capitalized on certain concepts of open world gaming and absolutely knocked them out of the park and into outer space. However, this is where we change gears, because there are many concepts that I believe Nintendo could have handled much better in Breath of the Wild. A lot better, actually. In the first place, it does feel a bit odd that Nintendo toyed with the concept of different levels of difficulty for enemies and different levels of weapons, but yet didn't introduce, like, XP for Link. I guess technically spending the 4 spirit orbs in game to get a heart container or a stamina vessel is leveling up for Link, but it's the fact that completing shrines is specifically the only way to do this that's the problem. See, normally in action-adventure, open-world RPG games of an extremely similar caliber, you're able to level up by gaining experience, which is awarded to you for doing all sorts of different things. Things that Breath of the Wild also features in the game. In Skyrim, for instance, you can fight monsters and explore dungeons and roam about the map and even craft all sorts of items, all of which gives you XP, which in turn gives you more damage, more health, more magic, levels. This gives the player incentive to kill all the enemies in a camp, or to explore every single room in a dungeon, or even just exploring the different parts of the map, because no matter what you do, you're not wasting time, because you gain XP and your character gets stronger for it, which makes it worth it even if you don't find a new weapon or piece of armor that you fall in love with. In Breath of the Wild, it doesn't matter how many monsters you kill or how many dishes you cook, because the only thing you'll ever gain from doing those things is monster materials, which are nice, of course, until you have literal hundreds of all of them, or weapons, which you do need a lot of because they break very quickly, or dishes, which are nice until you get armor, which renders literally any dish completely useless, except for temporary stamina and health dishes. Those will always be useful. But I feel like the lack of a level up system for Link based on XP negatively affected my drive to clear out every enemy camp that I came across after about mid-game and onward, because by that point I had pretty powerful weapons and I had enough monster materials to cover the upgrades that I needed, and I didn't want to spend the time or weapons, frankly, to clear out every single monster that I came across. Not to mention, a lot of the chests that you uncover in the game have rewards that are kind of lackluster or not quite as good as what you have. So there simply wasn't a reason to open every single chest anymore. Not to mention the pretty blatant lack of diversity in Breath of the Wild's enemies, which led to enemies becoming kind of boring to fight again after about midway in the game. See, even though a bokoblin or a moblin can reappear later in the game as a red, then blue, then black, then silver, then gold if you're an expert hard mode player, they all use the same kinds of weapons and the same attack patterns against Link. So after early game, you get used to fighting any one of these kinds of enemies. The only real difference between their colors is their health pool. Here's a little frame of reference for you. In Breath of the Wild, and I'm going to refer to my notes here, there are 98 total different enemies. That includes world bosses and all the versions of Ganon as well. But when you cut out the duplicates, like, you know, the multiple colors or the multiple different kinds of the same enemy that are just different elements, you are left with 28 different kinds of enemies in the game. For comparison, in Ocarina of Time, you know, a game that came out 19 years before Breath of the Wild, there were 87 total different enemies in the game, or 64 when you cut out the duplicates. That's well over twice the amount of unique enemies in Breath of the Wild. In Twilight Princess, which came out 12 years before Breath of the Wild, there were 107 total enemies, or 84 unique different kinds of enemies when you cut out the duplicates. That is literally 3 times the amount in Breath of the Wild. But yet Breath of the Wild's huge world was nearly 380 times larger than Twilight Princess's and over 3,600 times larger than Ocarina of Time. Let that sink in for a second. Combine this kind of painful lack of enemy diversity with the fact that you don't gain XP from killing enemies, and you're left with the answer of why I got bored with fighting in Breath of the Wild before too long. And speaking of Breath of the Wild's huge open world, it did introduce a new kind of open world experience to The Legend of Zelda, but let me explain what I mean by that, because technically speaking, The Legend of Zelda as a franchise has always had open world gameplay, ever since the first game. In the original, you were able to literally go left, right, up, down, wherever you wanted, exploring whatever dungeons in whatever order you wanted to. The series did begin to focus more on linear storytelling around the time of A Link to the Past and onward, when it introduced heavier in-game storytelling, but you've still always been able to pause the main storyline and go explore the world and complete side missions at your disposal. And this is the same style of open world gameplay that other extremely popular open world games like Skyrim or GTA or Elden Ring adopt as well. After all, there's nothing quite like having the power of choice to just pause everything that's going on in the world in order to catch a Hylian loach or ask a weird guy in the woods for an odd mushroom. But even though the Zelda games all the way up until Skyward Sword featured this open world concept, at least in regards to exploration and side quests, just locked behind a few gadgets every now and then, they never allowed their open world gameplay to take away from their acquired style of telling the player the story by having the player play through the story. Linear storytelling. That's where the open world of Breath of the Wild differs. For the first time in the series since A Link to the Past, linear storytelling was sacrificed in favor of this new version of open world gameplay. Right off the bat, when you start the game and you raise the Great Plateau Tower, you are immediately shown the endgame fight and its location. There's Ganon, right there, looking like an angry cloud monster. But Nintendo had to reveal this right out the shrine, because after you complete the only real thing that you have to do in the game, which is the first 4 shrines and, you know, the Great Plateau section, you really are 100% completely free to do whatever you want, whenever you want, at your pace. This is Breath of the Wild, a true open world experience. You even get the quest to defeat Ganon right off the bat, which kind of made a lot of people chuckle when they saw it. And you can do it if you want to. You know where he is. It's even marked on your map. And the most powerful weapons and equipment are in Hyrule Castle, right around Ganon. So there's not much reason to gear up anywhere else in the world unless you want to do shrines and get more hearts and stamina. And I've got to admit, that didn't sit super well with me. Because due to my perspective on Zelda games, which I acquired over the course of my entire childhood like I was talking about earlier, I was expecting something different. In all of those trailers leading up to the release of the game, we got to see hints of epic climactic battles and amazing music and this cast of new characters that I couldn't wait to get to know. The story of Breath of the Wild had everything it needed for a fantastic narrative arc. According to this chart here, as you can see, effective storytelling works best when you build tension with crisis after crisis after crisis, slowly just having everything bubble under the surface until everything bursts with the final climax, after which you have the resolution, be it good or bad. Breath of the Wild had this 100 years ago. When Link wakes up, aka when you come into the picture and start playing the game, you're somewhere out here. You do hear Zelda's voice, like, speaking to you in your mind and urging you to go defeat Ganon because she's getting kind of tired, but at the same time, you've got all this world in front of you to explore, and what's that? Is that snow? Is that snow I see over there? Have we ever had snow in a Zelda game? I want to go see what that's all about. And Zelda's been effectively keeping the big bad boar cloud at bay for the past century, so what's a few more weeks, am I right? And yes, it is true that while you explore the expansive world of Hyrule, you can discover the 13 forgotten memories of Link and try to piece together the story of what happened 100 years ago. But the point here is that the impactful emotional weight that comes from playing through a narrative that we've seen work in other open world games and specifically other Zelda games was sacrificed in Breath of the Wild, all to become one word: non-linear. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, was it worth it? Is the enormous world of Hyrule big enough and cluttered enough with enough content to merit the fact that they changed up and took away their storytelling? On the one hand, yes, because of several reasons. See my previous section when I praised Breath of the Wild non-stop. But on the other hand, no, because Breath of the Wild's huge world that's filled with verticality and hidden areas to explore is also lacking just content. Listen, there are 900 Korok seeds to find in the world. 900! And yes, I know that Nintendo put that massive amount in the game, not so that you'd find every one of them, but so that you didn't have a choice but to stumble across a lot of them. But that's really all they did with the open world. When you're exploring the vast wildernesses in the south, or the mountains to the west and east, or the canyons to the southwest, you'll run into one of four things: a Korok, some enemies, an NPC, or a shrine. And the NPCs that you do meet only ever end up speaking a few lines of dialogue, or needing to be saved from enemies, or giving you a quest that will reward you with a material or a cooking dish that you can get from literally anywhere else in the game. And yes, I understand there are a whole lot of NPCs in Breath of the Wild, like a staggering amount of NPCs in Breath of the Wild, but to quote my previous Breath of the Wild review video,
the point is, what's better? A bunch of characters with little development, or a few characters with a lot of development?
The classic argument of quality versus quantity, which will always be debatable by nature. In previous Zelda games, and even non-Zelda games like the often mentioned Skyrim or Elden Ring, exploring the world results in finding all sorts of unique stuff, like other dungeons or other unique NPCs, or just things, which are completely missing from Breath of the Wild in exchange for shrines, which are each shorter than dungeons, but there are lots more of them. Again, quantity over quality. Elden Ring, for example, knocked the concept of content in the open world out of the park. I mean, seriously, around every single bend in every corner and on top of every hill and under every bridge, there are just gobs of unique items, NPCs, monsters. It is actually legitimately overwhelming, okay? I'm having a meltdown just thinking about all the different things I've come across in Elden Ring personally. And on the other hand, Breath of the Wild has Korok seeds, which are poop. I'm not even kidding. Korok seeds are literal poop. Because of this, lots of fans of the series call Breath of the Wild's open world empty. And it hurts me to admit it, but I actually agree. Plus, there was a very large opportunity in Breath of the Wild that was completely missed out on, and that would be the villain of the game. You remember that saying that a hero is only as good as the villain? Well, it's in terms of storytelling. It means that a good villain is a great catalyst to push the hero or the story or just everything forward that much better. In order to really vibe with a fictional world or a fictional story, especially one that deals with good and evil, you need a really good villain that can push the hero of the story into challenging waters, and you need one that's capable of making intelligent decisions and even challenging your morals sometimes. You know, like Ganondorf from the Wind Waker, for instance. But doing this sort of thing requires, you know, a brain. And I'm not sure Calamity Ganon has one. Except for you, Ganon. You definitely have a brain. I think. The Ganon in Breath of the Wild is mindless, almost like an idea of evil as an entity rather than an entity with evil ideas. There's a reason why everybody freaked out when Ganondorf was revealed to be in Breath of the Wild 2 via the first trailer in 2019. We're all thirsty for an intelligent villain to return to the series and also to see if he rehydrates. The point is, the empty feeling world of Breath of the Wild could use a huge injection of enemies, an XP system, dungeons, NPCs, and a much better villain. But I've said enough at this point. You've all heard this stuff before. Ultimately though, even though I had more, I guess, negative things to say about Breath of the Wild than positive, unfortunately, that does not mean that I didn't like the game. I loved the game. Even back in the day, 5+ years ago, when I played the game for the first time and made that first review video, which you should definitely not watch, I always thought it was a really, really, really good game. Just not a super blow me out of the water great game. Something big happened earlier this year. My girlfriend happened. And no, we didn't get together this year. We've actually been dating since 2016, but this was the year that she decided to play an actual video game. Let me explain. This girl, bless her heart, was raised on Mario Kart and Disney movies. And there's not a damn thing wrong with that. And I think she may have even played Super Mario Bros. On the Wii growing up, but that was it. She never once touched a controller to play any sort of single player or adventure game of any sort, much less a Zelda game. The horror. Because of this, and this is not a slant against her family or anything, I love them to death, and people have a right to be into whatever they're into, but because of this, she grew up thinking, you know, video games are just things that you grow out of, right? I mean, you gotta grow up sometime. But this year, after many requests from me over the years, she finally decided to open up to the notion of playing a video game that isn't a racing or arcade style game. So we bought her a Switch OLED, and I recommended Breath of the Wild to go with it because it's new and it's a Zelda game and it's streamlined and it's fun and it's a Zelda game. And we fired it up. And let me tell you, I think the first few moments of watching someone who's never controlled a character in third person try to walk down the steps outside the Shrine of Resurrection and continually just fall and plummet to their death over and over again is something I will never forget. And I'm sure she won't either, because after about the 12th time she was getting a little frustrated. Actually, it's a testament to good video game design on Nintendo's part because it teaches players to be able to walk alongside cliffs and not, you know, plummet to their deaths. But she was a trooper and no matter what, stuck with it. At first, just because I asked her to. She's good people. I'm a lucky guy. I got to watch as she went from completely new to controlling a third-person view game in general, and even combat in video games aside from jumping on Goombas, to being able to sprint and jump alongside mountaintops without missing a step, best Lionels in combat, and snipe moving enemies from afar. And that's when something began to change in me. See, not only did she begin to develop skills for video games as a whole because of this brilliantly designed 3D action-adventure game, but she also began to develop a love and connection to the game world. Before too long, she would start asking me if she could play Breath of the Wild instead of, you know, watching a movie or a TV show, which made me extremely happy to see, of course. She began to make references to the world of Breath of the Wild, or maybe its characters in general, unrelated conversations that we would have in the middle of the day. And she refused to fight Calamity Ganon and complete the game until she discovered all 120 shrines and uncovered all 13 memories, all on her own. I watched this game and its world and its characters and its enemies and its music and its structure and its exploration captivate her and convince her that video games are beautiful works of art that should be enjoyed by people of all walks of life, from all backgrounds and of all ages. Breath of the Wild did, in a single playthrough, what I could not do for years. And that's when it all hit me. I was wrong about Breath of the Wild. It is a great game. It's one of the greatest games I've ever had the honor of playing, actually. But let me clarify something. I don't think I was wrong to compare it to previous Zelda games. I don't think anybody was wrong to compare it to previous Zelda games. I mean, it does have Zelda in the title. The Zelda franchise had nearly 20 entries in it before this game came out. It's only natural for fans of the games from before Breath of the Wild to compare the newest entry in the games to the games that were already out. How can you not compare something that is a part of an already established franchise with that franchise's name to itself? But on the other hand, why can't a franchise expand and evolve into something newer and greater? It's the same for Breath of the Wild. On the one hand, it is perfectly natural to compare it to its predecessors like Ocarina of Time or Twilight Princess, and get in all the nitty-gritty of how dense the world is per capita with enemies or Korok seeds or whatever. But on the other hand, once you get past all that comparison and really just focus on Breath of the Wild for Breath of the Wild's sake, you begin to see why it's so beautiful. You know what my girlfriend said when I mentioned to her that I thought Breath of the Wild's world was empty? She just kind of blinked and said that she actually felt that it was so cluttered that she almost found it overwhelming. The story was rich and deep, and she didn't mind that she didn't play through it because to her she was still experiencing it in a way by piecing it together. The voice acting in the cutscenes never failed to captivate her and grab her attention and keep her eyes locked on the screen, more so than when she had to read through dozens and dozens of lines of text boxes. And the shrines reach fresh and new and challenging and covered concepts that she wasn't previously used to and were never long enough to become overwhelming. See, I was wrong about what Breath of the Wild had set out to do. Nintendo decided that they wouldn't pigeonhole the Zelda franchise with the Zelda formula any longer, which is something that I can kind of respect since that's something I've been struggling with myself on the platform. It didn't set out to beat the previous Zelda games, it set out to reach new people. People like my girlfriend, who loved the shrines, and loved the enemies, and loved the music, because she didn't compare them to the other dungeons or the older music or the older enemies from the previous Zelda games. Perspective is everything, because beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's a life lesson that I don't think I'll ever forget. So anyway, it took me 5 years and a girlfriend willing to try something out simply because I asked her to before I was able to realize the real beauty that is Breath of the Wild. At the end of the day, I still don't think Breath of the Wild is my favorite Zelda game because that requires me to compare it to the previous Zelda games, which I enjoyed for all the different reasons that I spent this entire time detailing. But at the same time, I think Breath of the Wild just might be the greatest game I've ever played in general. That probably doesn't make any sense unless you're really vibing with me right now, in which case it probably makes perfect sense. Anyway, if you're still watching, thank you and congratulations. I'm a bit of a rambler, so this one ended up being a little bit longer than I was anticipating, but there was just a lot to say and cover about my journey from Breath of the Wild's release up until now. If you had a similar journey or feel the same way or feel differently, I would love to read about your experience in the comments below. Or if you just want to geek out about your favorite Zelda game, feel free to place that down there as well. If you'd like for me to make more videos where I review games or talk about my experiences, also let me know because there's a lot of opinions that are up here in this noggin of mine and I can talk for a long time. Subscribe if you haven't already to stick around for all sorts of new videos about new video games to come, and a hearty welcome to the newest member of my bandit crew, Donnie J. That's about all I've got for this one, so as always, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. This is Bandit, looking forward to seeing you next time, and signing out. Peace!